Hello, everyone. It's good to be back with you. This is November 22nd, 2023. I remember very well November 22nd, 1963. I was doing volunteer work for the Red Cross, signing up people to give blood in Washington, D.C. My shift was from 12 noon to 3 in the afternoon. About 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the afternoon, my supervisor came to me and told me to shut everything down, which was a surprise to me because the Red Cross blood drive was a big thing, not only in Washington, but in other major cities across the country on that particular day. It was a Friday. And I naturally asked, why? Why are we doing this? And she said that the president has been shot. And that was such a tremendous shock to me uh, that I will never forget the hour and certainly not the day that it happened. And leading up to that time and what that time meant and means today for America, let's explore a little bit now. Now, the Kennedy family was rather large, eventually 9 children. Here you see a photograph from the 1920s, before the family was finally complete. This was not particularly unusual. My father came from a family of 9 children as well. It was not unusual for immigrants from countries like Ireland or Russia, uh, mainly Roman Catholics and Jewish immigrants, to have large families. It was fairly typical at the time. But fortunately, by the time these youngsters were born that you're looking at here in the Kennedy family, the Kennedy family was quite well off. And I'll talk about that in a little while. Uh, but here you see the members of the Kennedy family. Uh, excuse me. I'll point them out to you. Jean, uh, Bobby, Patricia, Eunice, uh, Kathleen. Uh, this is John F. Kennedy, and the oldest, Joseph Kennedy Jr. And this picture was taken in the late 1920s. JFK, you see here, was born in 1917. And they were a very well-to-do family. They not only had a home in Boston, they had a home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, right on the coast, and a home in Palm Beach, Florida, where they spent a good deal of time during the winter. Now, here you see Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the family. Uh, Joseph Kennedy, by this time, which was 1931, as you can see from the photograph, uh, to his right, his eldest son, Joe Jr., and to his left, uh, Ja Jack or John F. Kennedy, uh, at their residence in Palm Beach. By this time, 1931, Joseph Kennedy had amassed a considerable fortune. He began in real estate in the Boston metropolitan area and spread to a number of different business enterprises and activities, including the United, the United States Steel Corporation. So he was one of the wealthiest people in Massachusetts. And he used his wealth not only for homes, as we see here, but also for philanthropic purposes. And he gave his sons an excellent education, and eventually they went to Harvard University. Now, here is the Kennedy clan at their home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, on the Massachusetts seacoast, and you can see all the children here, as well as his wife, Rose. Rose Kennedy was the daughter of John Fitzpatrick. Uh, the Fitzpatricks were very prominent in Massachusetts Democratic Party politics. And this is how Joseph Kennedy, Sr., sitting here, this is how Joseph Kennedy Sr. Got involved in politics, in addition to his numerous business interests. Uh, the way politics evolved, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest of the United States in the early 20th century, of course, you had the Democratic and the Republican Party. The Democratic Party was overwhelmingly consisted of uh, Roman Catholic and Jewish sons and daughters of immigrants. So it was really the party of immigrants, and uh, Irish, Italian, and Russian Jewish people in the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party had a reputation of not being very open to immigrants, for one thing, and secondly, particularly for Roman Catholic and Jewish immigrants. And you may know that in 1924, the US Congress severely limited the immigration into the United States of Roman Catholic and Jewish immigrants. So, uh, and that Congress was controlled by Republicans. Uh, so there was a not only a political divide, but particularly a religious divide in America as far as the two major political parties were concerned. And Joseph Kennedy, whom we see here in the center, because of his wealth um, and his connections through marriage to his wife, became very prominent in the Democratic Party. And when Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, he eventually named Joseph Kennedy as our ambassador to the United Kingdom. So that was sort of a payoff for the financial support that Joseph Kennedy had given to the Roosevelt uh, campaign. Um, but we know that Kennedy Sr., sitting here, became disillusioned with the United Kingdom and believed that the future of Europe belonged with Germany. Germany in the Third Reich under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Uh, Kennedy was not a Nazi, but he seemed to favor Germany over the United Kingdom. And for an ambassador to the United Kingdom, this was not particularly good. So President Roosevelt relieved him of that position, and the two really split uh, as a result of that. However, as we all know, in 1941, the U.S. entered World War II, which had been going on for 2 years. Of course, that was also the year that Russia entered the war in June of 1941, and we entered in December of 1941. And young Jack Kennedy, John Kennedy, joined the Navy. Joseph Kennedy Sr. Had political ambitions for his sons, both Joseph and Jack or John. And he felt, although he was not particularly supportive of fighting on the side of the UK, that don't forget he was Irish, and the Irish and the English sometimes they don't get along. But in any case, uh, he was well aware that if you wanted a political future in America, you'd better get with the program and uh, get into a uniform and fight for our country, fight for democracy against the totalitarian regimes of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. And so uh, young Jack Kennedy joined the Navy. And eventually, he rose up in the ranks to command a PT boat. A PT boat was a boat a small boat that went quickly through the waters and provided equipment and some personnel for the U.S. Navy. So it was very important. However, because of the importance of these PT boats, they were targets for the Japanese in particular, and um, uh, John F. Kennedy's PT boat was targeted, torpedoed, and sunk. He survived, but it became part of his political narrative that he not only fought in World War II, but he was a hero with saving his men and and surviving this attack by the Empire of Japan. So when he left the service at the end of World War II, uh, John F. Kennedy decided to run for Congress. And again, you'll see here in his office a picture of his mom and his dad. His father was orchestrating all of this. In other words, young Jack Kennedy uh, did not say one day, "Oh, maybe I'll run for Congress." This was dictated to him to some degree by his father, even more so in this 1946 election, because what had happened, unfortunately, during World War II was that Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s favorite son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., was killed during World War II. So Joseph Kennedy Sr., of course, was devastated by this loss, but he moved all of his ambitions for his children onto John F. Kennedy. And that's why uh, young John F. Kennedy ran for Congress. Now, he served 3 terms in Congress, uh, and in 1952, he ran for and was successful in becoming a United States Senator. Now, as many of you know, the U.S. Congress consists of 2 branches. One, the U.S. Congress with 435 members in it, and a more exclusive part of the Congress, the U.S. Senate, uh, now with 100 members uh, in it. And it's a more prestigious body. It particularly in foreign policy and in budgetary matters. So this was a step up from the House of Representatives for young Jack Kennedy when he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1952. In the meantime, he was named the most eligible bachelor in Massachusetts. Uh, and that story ended when he married uh, Jacqueline Bouvier. And here is their wedding reception in September of 1953. Uh, Jacqueline Kennedy, whom we see here, uh, her maiden name was Jacqueline Bouvier, and she came from a prominent family in Massachusetts, so that uh, was not particularly surprising. At the time, she was a journalist for a newspaper which no longer exists called the Washington Times. She was living in Washington, D.C., and that's where they came together. Of course, Jack Kennedy was in Congress, so that's where, in Washington, D.C., so that's where he met uh, Jacqueline Kennedy. And he was married. He was 36 years old, and she was 24. And this age difference was a matter of something for the tabloid newspapers. Oh, he's looking at very younger women and so on. But for most people, it really didn't matter. What mattered for his constituents in Massachusetts was that she was beautiful and she was Roman Catholic. I mean that settled the issue. And John Kennedy had this always this youthful look, so he looked younger than his years. So this was not really a problem, except for the newspaper folks. Um, in 1956, 3 years after this photograph was taken, at the Democratic National Convention, young John F. Kennedy received several votes for vice president. Uh, the presidential Democratic presidential candidate that year was Adlai Stevenson, a former governor of the state of Illinois. Uh, but it reflected the view of Democrats generally, and in the party in particular, that this young man had a great future. Uh, to be to be nominated for the office of vice president, and it's interesting because if you look at John F. Kennedy's Senate record, in other words, the bills he sponsored, the speeches he made on the floor of the U.S. Senate, is nothing particularly interesting or that stands out as, aha, this person is a statesman. There was just nothing like that. In other words, he was not a leader in the US Senate, but he was very photogenic, very attractive, and he fit the profile of a Democratic Party candidate, except for one thing, and that was his religion. There was a Roman Catholic who ran for president in 1928, Al Smith. He lost badly to the Republican candidate Herbert Hoover, and it may be that any Democratic candidate running in 1928 would have lost. But the campaign was vicious, uh, particularly against the religion of Al Smith. So while people were sort of comfortable supporting him for vice president, no, not for president. But John F. Kennedy, backed by his family's finances, entered the Democratic presidential primary in uh, early 1960. As you know, the election takes place in November of 1960. And by January of 1960, he was already in the race against Hubert Humphrey, the senator from Minnesota. Uh, and initially, many people didn't give him much of a chance. He was young. He really hadn't generated a significant record in the Senate as Humphrey had, uh, and he was Roman Catholic. So it was a surprise in the early primaries that uh, John F. Kennedy uh, was successful, particularly when he and Hubert Humphrey entered the West Virginia primary. Um, I can't give you the statistics, but the number of Roman Catholics in West Virginia are very small. It's an overwhelmingly Protestant state. And John F. Kennedy won the primary against Hubert Humphrey. And that gave him legitimacy that someone whose religion was a minority and sometimes a despised minority could win a primary in a state like West Virginia. But West Virginia is only one state, it's a small state. Uh, well, he won the uh, presidential nomination, and this is his campaign poster, Leadership for the 60s, Kennedy for President. And major points of his campaign was that he represented a new generation. The baby boomers born in the 1940s were coming of age. And I remember very well, I was too young to vote, but I went to a Kennedy rally in 1960, and there were lots of young people. It was almost like a rock concert, if you know what I mean. Uh, and there was this really good looking guy up there, didn't look anything like the previous presidents, and he was one of us, uh, the grandson of immigrants. He wasn't Protestant. He was Roman Catholic, and that energized us uh, as well. Uh, and that generated a tremendous amount of energy for young people, even though we couldn't vote, but we passed this excitement along to our parents. But another interesting thing about the 1960 presidential election were the debates. For the first time, two presidential candidates debated each other on television. Television was a relatively new medium by 1960, but millions of Americans had television sets. And of course, presidential candidates, our country is so big, can't see everybody, all of the voters, all of the time. But television, you can attract millions of viewers just for one night. And the political pundits, the experts, so to speak, believed that the debates were a tie. Maybe Nixon won the debate, maybe JFK won the debate, but they were very close. But for the voters, they were really attracted to John F. Kennedy. Nixon had some bad makeup, which didn't cover the stubble on his, the dark stubble on his face, and he sort of looked almost like a criminal on television because the lights uh, were so bright. Of course, in those days, TV was in its early stages, and the other thing was that JFK came across as being the most optimistic, and it was an optimistic time. We were young. We didn't fit into the old establishment, and we looked toward a future uh, that was uncertain because we were right in the midst of the Cold War, but yet could have promise. And we projected all of that onto John F. Kennedy, not onto Richard Nixon, who had been vice president under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. But there was still a problem in John F. Kennedy's campaign. And the problem was that, again, he was a Roman Catholic. Uh, there were definitely signs, literal signs, but also in the media that hey, I'm not going to vote for a Roman Catholic for president because I don't want the Pope to rule America. So, what Kennedy understood was that he needed the South. Historically, at that time, up to that time, Southern states voted for the Democratic Party. Why? When the Democratic Party up north consisted primarily of Roman Catholic and Jewish voters, why did the South, overwhelmingly evangelical Protestant, vote for the Democrats as well? Very simple. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And if you lived in the South, you were still fighting the American Civil War. I lived in Memphis, and if you wanted to vote in Memphis, you had to, of course, register to vote and declare a party because there was a political primary and you can only vote in your party's primary. But there was only one party in Memphis, Tennessee, the Democratic Party. At the same time, the overwhelming majority of people in the American South were evangelical Protestants. And evangelical Protestants many view at that time Roman Catholics as the Antichrist, as somehow a bogus, a false religion. Uh, and they would never vote for a Roman Catholic. So what Kennedy did, he went to Houston, Texas, where the Southern Baptist Convention was going on, and he talked to the delegates. Uh, Baptists are the largest denomination, religious denomination in the American South. And he wanted to convince them of two things. First, that if he became president, he would not look to Rome, to the Pope in Rome, for policies in America. And secondly, he would be open to all religions. And he recognized that the Protestant religion was the majority religion in America. And he would make certain that that would remain the case, not only in the country, but particularly in his cabinet and advisors. Uh, that helped a bit. But let's take a look at the electoral map of 1960. As many of you know, the popular vote is irrelevant in a presidential election. Successful presidential candidates must accumulate a majority of electoral votes. Each state has a number of electoral votes based upon population plus their representatives in the U.S. Senate. So, which is two. So here is the electoral map for the 1960 presidential election. Red is Republican, blue is Democrat. And if you want to know why Democrats are blue and Republicans are red, this dates back to 1980, even later than what we're talking about now, when the NBC television network said, "Hey, everybody has a color TV, so let's make the map colorful, and we'll give Democrats blue and Republicans red." So it has no political meaning. It's really a meaning for television. And you can see here that the solid South became a little less so. Uh, Kennedy lost Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. He also lost a few electoral votes in Alabama and Mississippi, even though Alabama and Mississippi had given a majority of their votes to John F. Kennedy. Normally, all of the electors for that state would vote for the candidate who won that state. In this case, John Kennedy in Alabama and Mississippi. But one or two of the delegates to the Electoral College in Alabama and Mississippi said they could not vote for a Roman Catholic. And they did not do that. Now, if the electoral vote was very close, it was fairly close, but not really that close, 303 to 219, you need the majority of, excuse me, of 270 to win, and Kennedy had 303. So that was a fairly comfortable margin. But you can see here that the solid Democratic South is breaking up. Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Florida. But the Deep South remains Democratic. Um, the saying was that if a dog ran for president on the Democratic ticket, the South would vote for the dog because of the Civil War. Uh, but if that dog were Roman Catholic, he would lose several votes, and that's what happened to make this race a bit closer. So John F. Kennedy became president, and this was Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1961. And you can see John F. Kennedy and Jackie. It was very cold, obviously, in Washington D.C. There was snow on the ground, walking to the Capitol to give the inaugural address. And in his inaugural address, he challenged Americans, asked not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And as a young person, I found this exciting. Yeah, uh, because he included all of us in this great enterprise called the United States of America. And we were young, and he was young, and his wife was young, his family was young, and this was just marvelous. We were way high in our enthusiasm. Uh, now, uh, Kennedy's had two children, John Jr., you see here, and Caroline. And this is in their home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. Um, and it was a family that epitomized America in the early 1960s, a family of vigor. That word vigor was used over and over again. Young, vigorous. I mean, um, not to cast any aspersions, but compare it with our current uh, president. I mean, this was what America was in the early 1960s, and we were so happy about it. In May of 1962, Marilyn Monroe uh, came to the White House to sing Happy Birthday to John F. Kennedy. I mention this because rumor had it that John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe had an affair. I can't vouch for that, of course, but John F. Kennedy did have a roving eye. Uh, During his presidency, which I will tell you quite honestly was mediocre, uh, he had some foreign policy missteps like the Bay of Pigs, which was a botched invasion of communist Cuba that should never have happened. But fortunately, he patched it up with Nikita Khrushchev, the Russian leader at the time. So we avoided World War III. And on the domestic front, the key issue of the early 1960s was civil rights for our Black population. And Kennedy was very reluctant to move on this. He opposed the freedom rides, that is, the attempts of Black and white Americans to integrate into interstate transportation. He opposed Martin Luther King Jr.'s demonstrations, and he did so because by 1963, he had decided that he was going to run for a second term, and he desperately needed the South. Remember, as I said, the southern states were the bedrock of the Democratic Party, and he did not want to do anything in terms of racial issues that would upset white Southern voters, because at that time, black Southern voters in most states could not vote. So he was very careful. However, in the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. told him, "Look, the situation is really bad. I'm just going to do what I need to do." And he started a big demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, that resulted in violence. And he organized an amazing march in Washington, D.C. in August of 1963 that to demand legislation to end discrimination against Black Americans, to end segregation in public accommodations, to enable Black citizens to vote. As part of his policy, if he wasn't forward looking on civil rights, he was very forward looking on technology. And he started really our space program uh, to land a man on the moon by 1969. That probably was his singular accomplishment as president. Now, by June of 1963, he had come to believe that civil rights legislation was necessary. And here you see Martin Luther King Jr. And a group of black and white civil rights leaders at the White House in June of 1963. And Kennedy said he was going to put a bill into Congress for Congress to pass that would end discrimination in public accommodations, in trains and buses and movie theaters, restaurants, and so on, in the South, uh, that uh, barred African Americans from full citizenship. Uh, and he gave a speech on television. And for the first time, a president said that civil rights was not only a political issue, civil rights for Black Americans was a moral issue. He put the bill into Congress, but really didn't push it, didn't lobby for it. Again, he was thinking, hey, I've got a presidential election coming up next year. I don't want to anger white Southern voters. Well, he realized that meetings like this and speeches like that he gave on television calling civil rights a moral issue had upset many white Southerners. And his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, was from Texas. And he knew through Johnson and through his aides that Texans were very upset, that white Texans were very upset with Kennedy. So he decided that he needed to go down to Texas to tour the major cities like Dallas and Fort Worth to shore up his support. And Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, said, "No, no, you shouldn't do that. They don't like you there. It's just too dangerous to go there." And John F. Kennedy, with youthful vigor, said, "Oh, come on. I have Secret Service and nothing is going to happen." Well, he went down there anyway, despite Lyndon Johnson's warning. And you see him in this motorcade with his wife, Jacqueline, uh, the governor of Texas, John, at the time, John Connolly, and his wife. And they're having a motorcade through Dallas. And then something happens. This is Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife Marina in Minsk, Belarus in 1961. Lee Harvey Oswald had very obviously very negative feelings against the United States, and particularly against President John F. Kennedy. And he was determined to take action accordingly. And he went up to this building in Dallas called the Texas School Book Depository. Texas is the only state in the country that houses all of its high school textbooks in one building and then distributes them around the state. In my state of North Carolina and every other state, each school district is responsible for distributing textbooks, not centralized at the state, but that doesn't exist in Texas. And this is the window from which he shot Kennedy. And as you can see, the motorcade was passing along here. As you can see, it's not an easy shot. It's not like walking up to somebody and pointing a gun and shooting. It really takes luck and marksmanship, and that's precisely what happened. This is the moment he was shot, and he lurched forward, and his wife Jacqueline, you see, holding him. And the next scene we saw, and I remember watching this on television after we closed down our Red Cross, was Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president, who had accompanied Kennedy to Dallas on the plane to Washington, D.C., taking the oath of office. And this is Jacqueline Kennedy. And you can see from her face how shocked and disoriented she is. This is Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of Lyndon B. Johnson. It was an extremely somber moment, and you couldn't process it. I couldn't process it, and millions of Americans, millions of other Americans could not process it either. And then the next thing we saw was the funeral. And here's his young son, John F. Kennedy Jr., as the casket slowly rolled by Washington, D.C. He gave the commander-in-chief a salute. So what can we say about John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 2023? It has been 60 years since his death, and I look upon it as a promise unfulfilled. He did not do much during his time in office. Certainly, he boosted the space program. Uh, but besides that, the major issue of the day, civil rights, he moved very slowly. The first thing that his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, did was to push the Congress to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So Johnson didn't care about the fallout. He thought this was the good thing, the right thing to do. But more than that, John F. Kennedy represented youth, represented American promise, represented the future for all of us. And suddenly that was taken away. And to some degree, our innocence was taken away as well. And that was the most hurtful legacy of November 22nd, 1963. Thank you all very much. What was Kennedy's main reform? He reformed the federal government in terms of developing committees and commissions for scientific research. Uh, the thing is that when you're looking at, say, diseases like cancer, for example, it's very expensive to conduct research. And Kennedy put a lot of money and supported federal funding for research, particularly through the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which is located in suburban Washington, D.C. He did that. The second thing he did, he was the first president really to sound the alarm concerning environmental issues, concerning what we were doing to our air, to, to our water supply, to our food supply. He was a big supporter of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. And in fact, he went on television to promote this book, which is something no president had ever done before. For environmental issues and for educational and scientific issues, he provided some leadership. But again, in terms of civil rights, which was the real major issue of the time, he was quite slow in supporting those measures. And only through the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson did we get the necessary legislation and support. What did Kennedy do to ease relations with the USSR? How would you describe his personal relationship with Soviet leader Khrushchev? Well, as I mentioned, with the Bay of Pigs, this was not a good relationship, but it improved because I think both leaders, both Khrushchev and Kennedy, saw that they were close to the brink. We were close to the brink of war and perhaps nuclear war. And both leaders drew back from that. And they said, well, let's rethink this. Let's have a direct line, or a direct telephone line to each other. Let's calm down and let's see where we can uh, compromise. Um, and Kennedy gave up something too. Khrushchev got the missiles out of Cuba, and Kennedy uh, got the missiles out of Turkey that were directed at the Soviet Union. Oddly enough, although the Bay of Pigs and although the placement of missiles in Cuba were disasters, uh, it uh, the two men uh, were level-headed enough to uh, say, "Hey, peace is better. We're not going to be friends. We're still going to be adversaries, but we're not going to destroy each other." How are the lives of Kennedy and Monroe connected? How did their acquaintances influence their destinies? That's a great question. Um, Biographies of Kennedy I've read indicated he did have an affair with Marilyn Monroe. It's not something that, oh yeah, here's the evidence, and it's inferred. But it's also true that th- 3 months after the that birthday party that I mentioned at the White House, 3 months after that, Marilyn Monroe committed suicide. Now, in in her last conversation, she didn't mention John F. Kennedy, but you would have to make some connection between what happened in May and what happened in August when she took her own life. Um, at the same time, uh, she was not the only mistress of John F. Kennedy. He had a significant roving eye, and it's documented that he had liaisons with other women, not as prominent as Marilyn Monroe, but certainly in defiance of his own marriage. Uh, Intimates say he was not particularly happy in his marriage, but of course, in those days, especially as a president, you wouldn't air your marital problems. Uh, so uh, there were some issues there, no doubt, and he had affairs, which, by the way, is not unusual among American presidents. Franklin D. Roosevelt had a number of affairs. Warren Harding fathered a son illegitimately with one of his girlfriends. This is uh, not unusual for a president, but certainly in our media saturated era, it's obviously going to come out. Um, what impact did the assassination of John F. Kennedy have on American society? Well, as I noted, I think we lost our innocence. I mean, I for one, uh, had unbounded optimism about the future. And you know, you looked at this young president in the White House, and I wasn't that involved in public policy or anything like that. He just generated this vigor, and we're going to do great things, and it's going to be a great country and a great future. Um, Now, when that happened, you start to wonder, well, if that could happen, other things can fall apart. uh, as well. Uh, and I will say that his successor, Lyndon Johnson, tried to keep up the optimism uh, through civil rights legislation. Um, but once that was completed and we got bogged down in Vietnam, uh, it was very different. If you want a tremendous distinction, look at America in 1963 and then in 1968 when we were starting to tear each other apart. Now, of course, the war in Vietnam had a significant impact on that, but I believe strongly that Kennedy's assassination was like a jolt. Um, Reality intervened. We were no longer in Camelot. In fact, I don't know if you know the play Camelot. Uh, it never rains till after sundown. By 9 the morning fog must disappear. It was perfect. Washington, D.C. was Camelot. And then suddenly it wasn't. And for a young person, and there were millions of us baby boomers, uh, that was a difficult reality. Well, thank you all. I hope I haven't been too depressing, uh, but I think we should view November 22nd, 2023 as a commemoration of Kennedy's assassination, but also as a rededication to the principles of democracy. Thank you all very much.